this is Kevin Burke of Rachel's Vineyard. Welcome to Oceans of Mercy. Friends, in our corporate media, we often hear from experts that claim that there's no negative impacts from abortion. It's a safe, even empowering procedure. You probably have friends and family that see abortion as a safe and necessary medical procedure for women with no negative impacts on the parents of the aborted child. That's why today's guest is the perfect person to help us charitably counter such misinformation. Dr. Catherine Coyle earned a PhD in educational psychology at the University of Wisconsin. She's a registered nurse and holds a master's degree in psychiatric nursing. She's taught at both Edgewood College and the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Dr. Coyle has developed a healing program for men who have been hurt by abortion and has scientifically documented its effectiveness. She's author of a groundbreaking book, Men and Abortion, A Path to Healing, which is based on her research and is available from Life Cycle Books. Dr. Coyle is an associate of the International Forgiveness Institute and continues to pursue research in areas of both forgiveness and emotional trauma after abortion. She's published several papers and given numerous presentations concerning the effects of abortion on men, the psychological process of forgiveness, and forgiveness therapy. If that's not enough, friends, she's the co-director, along with Dr. Vincent Rue, of the Alliance for Post-Abortion Research and Training. Dr. Catherine Coyle, welcome to Oceans of Mercy.
Thank you.
There's so much I want us to cover today. We're probably going to have you on again, so we do get to everything. But what I'd like to start with is your groundbreaking book, Men and Abortion, A Path to Healing. I think you published this in the later 1990s, and at that time, I think few were thinking about the impact of abortion on men. Can you give us some background on how you came to write that book?
Well, it started with grad school. I was finishing up a master's. I was going to be a nurse psychotherapist, and I was offered a job to teach. And I was expecting my first child. And with this job, I was able to be home almost full time. So I accepted the job, fell into teaching, found out I loved it, and remained there for many years. While I was teaching, I got a flyer about a brown bag lunch where Dr. Robert Enright was going to be speaking about his work on forgiveness. And it turned out he was a professor of developmental psychology, which I wanted to study at the doctoral level. And so I eventually went back for my doctorate, had Bob for my advisor, studied forgiveness with him. And Bob is a believer, and so he was very supportive of my desire to test a forgiveness therapy intervention with men who had been through abortion. It would have been tough to find an advisor that's supportive.
Dr. Coyle, how did you come to encounter men who had this loss?
Well, to be honest, I hadn't had experience with men, only with women about that issue. Okay. But there was nothing out there. So I thought, I'm going to see if this is effective. And it was, I'm happy to say, because it was a 2.5-year study. And out of that came the book, because I was encouraged by other people involved in healing after abortion to get something out there that various people and organizations would have to use as a resource when they worked with men.
What were some, as you kind of began to write the book and put together the results of your research, what were some of the general findings that you were encountering with men, from their experience with their partner having an abortion?
Well, I'll run through the emotion list that we've observed repeatedly now. First of all, it became very clear that men do not perceive abortion as a benign experience. Regardless of the decision-making ahead of time, this is not an easy time for them. Clearly, they have some ambivalence. like women, there can be a mix of both relief and regret. Of course, that's not surprising. We know a lot of people facing unplanned pregnancies are not ready for parenthood. And because of the nature of abortion procedures, decisions have to be made very, very quickly.
So there's some sense of pressure involved, right?
Very, very much so. And that's just one, as you well know, of many pressures.
Sure.
Anger is apparent, especially when the abortion occurs against the man's wishes.
Mm-hmm.
Either because his partner is insisting or some other friend or family member has been exerting influence for that decision.
Mm-hmm.
Anger can sometimes be turned against the self when men feel that they've failed to behave responsibly. Sometimes we saw that anger being acted out in risk-taking behaviors. Other times it, I believe, becomes almost a kind of coping mechanism, because many of us, not just men, would rather be angry than feel anxiety or helpless or grief or guilt, whatever. So it almost becomes, many emotions are funneled into what appears to be anger, but there's a lot more under the surface.
That's interesting. Very interesting. I think would you say that men perhaps have more of a vulnerability to go in the direction of anger rather than some of those more vulnerable emotions? Or
I think so.
Okay.
I think so. It now, things may be changing. You've got to remember, my demographic grew up with somewhat different role expectations than men today. But I think it's a more acceptable emotion, perhaps, for men, both from their own perspective and that from people outside. Another difference is that men may tend to intellectualize the experience more than women. At the very least, men are less likely than women to want to go there and talk about something that personal.
Yes.
Again, I'm sure your work has made you very aware of that challenge in dealing with them.
Sure.
We've found that men tend to defer the decision to their partners, thinking that's what they should be doing. So even if they are preferring to see that pregnancy come to term and be a parent, they will not always disclose that, because they think their job is to support her, and because it is her body and ultimately then her decision. And of course, they've been told that repeatedly. And there's some truth to that. I mean, she is accepting the physiological risks entailed with pregnancy. But so many times they carry this ambivalence, or even this deep uncertainty and unwillingness to give up this child in an attempt to support the woman. And that, of course, complicates things considerably in terms of their emotional response, because what they're doing is they're setting them aside in an attempt to support her. And of course, we know what happens to emotions that we bury or set aside, sooner or later.
That's such an important point, Dr. Coyle. And, when we started, we talked about this is a very short duration, high pressure situation where they're making that decision. Yet, I'm sure you've seen in your research, it has repercussions that extend well beyond when a man has those things going on and he doesn't have a way to process that, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And as I said, we know emotions that are suppressed or repressed do not go away. Somehow they find a way to leak out. So we've got, what have I said so far? We've got ambivalence, we've got anger, anxiety. Now, something interesting about anxiety is that, let me back up just a minute. There's way less than 100 studies out there about men and abortion. Probably in the neighborhood of 50 something. That's it. That means there is no body of literature about them. They've been completely marginalized here. In those studies, very few have used clinical measures for anxiety. But when they have been used, the men score in the clinically significant range. So we know from our training as therapists, that's a red flag.
Mm-hmm. That means you're going to have consequences, physical, obviously emotional, relational. It might affect their work.
Yep.
It's when you say clinically significant, it's just this is something that's very important and can have lots of repercussions for them, right?
Yes, and I mean, for instance, I worked with one fellow who had to quit school. I mean, he couldn't focus on school. Another one quit his job. He couldn't focus on anything. I mean, he basically was handicapped for some period of time until he could literally get a grip long enough to focus on these other important aspects of life. We of course see grief, intense grief, especially when the decision is made against the man's wishes. Something very sad to me personally. I find it very touching. I struggle for the right word to describe it. Is the persistence of a lot of these emotions. We've had fellas respond to our surveys decades after the fact, and yet they're still struggling. They say they still frequently think about this child that's missing at the dinner table. They still question themselves. It's difficult. It's clear without a large body of research that we've got some people in our population here who really need some help and support, and they're just not getting it.
Yeah, it's very important. That's probably one of the most important messages you're sharing today is based on, again, we need more research, but based on what we know already, there's definitely a large, given that there's been 65 million procedures, there's a large segment of men out there who are, physically and emotionally hurting and would really benefit from help.
Yes, definitely. And, as I mentioned, the anxiety that when we looked at that using a clinical scale and what we found in another study along the same lines, because of course, PTSD is an anxiety disorder. We found that men who disagreed with the decision were significantly more likely to have symptoms of full-blown PTSD. And these guys are just falling through the cracks. They're walking around traumatized without any attention. What we haven't looked at, and again, this is now my demographic, is how many men seek counseling. Because from our studies, we don't yet have large enough samples to generalize. But what we did find was it was a minority of men who sought out counseling. Now, quite a few would speak to a friend or a family member, but did not get professional counseling. I was told by a young man that he thinks that's a lot different these days. I don't know. You would know better than I, given that you're involved in counseling.
No, I think it's still a huge challenge. When I talk to others in this work, and I talk to some men who have gone through abortion recovery programs or counseling or both, and they're trying to raise awareness. There's a tremendous amount of reluctance to go there, number one, and also to connect with someone who's considered a professional, like a counselor or psychiatrist or psychologist. There's kind of a stigma associated with that, which brings to mind, we're both members of the Men in Abortion Network, and they have in addition, they have a mentor program that you can, meninabortion.net, you can go online and you can connect with another man who's not a psychiatrist, psychologist, Although sometimes that is a really important option if you're experiencing traumatic, responses to your pain. But still, that it can be an opening of a door to that. So we're talking about some of the based on your research and the repercussions men are experiencing. How do we help them find help that's available? What have you found is important in your own work with men? And feel free to bring more research into this, but I also want to let our viewers know we're going to also be talking about the good news of there is help out there. There is ways to work through this pain, work through these feelings and grief, etc.
Well, I think what we need to do is raise awareness, first of all, among professional counselors.
Amen.
Now, if you look at organizations like Heartbeat and CareNet, they're already on board. They already understand that men as well as women may need some help. But we need professional counselors to consider the fact that men can be harmed emotionally, psychologically from a partner's abortion. And one would hope then that their empathetic nature would cause those counselors to perhaps take pregnancy histories with male clients, relationship histories, so that they could very gently uncover what is, of course, a very private experience that a lot of people don't want to volunteer, even if they know where to go for counseling.
Is it possible to do that, Dr. Coyle, without getting into the politics of it? Because, a lot of these counseling organizations, professional organizations are at the very least neutral on abortion, and most often they're proponents of abortion rights. Can we introduce this and say, look, we could deal with this, introduce some of these? You just mentioned some really important things like, pregnancy, the reproductive histories, pregnancy histories, relational histories that can open the door to what was very likely may not be their presenting problem, but it opens the door to at least recognizing that as an issue. Do you think we can do that with all the because it's such a contentious issue, obviously, in our society?
I think we can.
Yeah.
I don't know that we're going to do it through pro-life conferences because we're speaking to the choir.
Mm-hmm.
I think it can be done with other professional councils or conferences, rather. One doesn't have to be presenting a pro-life or pro-abortion perspective to encourage counselors to consider that this is a loss. It's a huge challenge, and I don't mean for a minute to imply that that's all we need to do, because as you know, even bringing up the possibility that females may have difficulty after an abortion is often rejected out of hand because it's too risky. It's too risky for a lot of people to go there. And that's unfortunate.
That's good.
Because I don't care what your opinion is about abortion politically. As a nurse, as a trained counselor, as an educator of college students, it behooves me to have some empathy for their experience, whatever it was.
Absolutely.
And maybe that's the way to appeal to counselors, to appeal to what I think among many of them is a natural empathy. And that's why they're drawn to therapy and counseling in the first place. So, I mean, I think they're out there willing to hear us, but it's a matter of avoiding any hint of the political.
Yeah.
And we can only do that at our end. We can't really alter their perceptions of that much. So.
Okay, good. Well, I hope that anyone listening who is a counselor or, a healthcare professional, medical professional, and organizations like, Alliance for Post-Abortion Research and Training, yourself and Dr. Rue, Men in Abortion Network, there's so many groups that are willing to help you, get you the information and resources, even offer some mentorship, I'm sure, if you want to reach out to your professional organizations and they're having conferences or, even small scale things like a gathering of local therapists in a community who are getting together to support one another, and
Mhm.
do some personal training and things. Those could be opportunities to gently introduce this in a non-political way, because there's so much need out there.
And speaking of the Men and Abortion Network, there's resources posted there. So for pro-life organizations, for instance, or maybe just let's call it a neutral about the issue, there is an article on there about starting a men's ministry with some general guidelines. But getting back to appealing to counselors to look at the potential damage done by elective abortion, not just for their male clients, but to always ask their female clients, of course, too, pregnancy history, but also couples,
Mhm.
because we haven't talked about how abortion can impact relationships today, but we know it can. And I think for professional counselors to ask about their couple history in terms of reproduction could be real helpful. Now, it gets a little sticky because you don't want to get into their past history while they're together, of course. But frequently, as we know, when couples go in for therapy, they are also seen individually by the therapist.
Mhm.
And during that period of time, one can collect their individual histories, because we know now that those individual histories can impact in negative ways future relationships.
Well, I guess it would be I mean, just talking about some of we're just touching on some of the issues that people are dealing with emotionally after an abortion. Even just some of those basic issues we touched on, it would be impossible for them not to impact somebody's ability to trust, their
Yes.
communication with their partner, their sexual intimacy. I mean, we could go on, but yeah, you raise a really important
Yeah.
point, that all these issues, for either whether it's a man or woman, it's going to have relational implications, and so we want to. It's a good point to also have that on the radar of counselors and folks doing pastoral ministry in their faith communities as well.
Well, and we know that both men and women can have sexual problems
Mhm.
after an abortion. Big surprise there. And how can any counselors effectively help their clients if they don't find out about some of this pregnancy history? It eludes me how we wouldn't want to
Yeah.
get into that in depth.
Dr. Coyle, I want to make sure we leave time for you to talk about forgiveness therapy, if you wanted to touch on that today as well.
Um,
It's up to you. We'll definitely have another opportunity to come together and cover stuff. But if you wanted to touch on that, we could. I know that's a big part of your work with men and with helping folks find some healing.
Well, you know what? I'm going to pass and say let's talk a little bit about men and then a little bit more about maybe relationships and counseling, because the
Sure.
forgiveness piece is large.
Okay, we'll cover that in our next session, part 2.
It's large, and I'd like to get into it enough so that any people who are viewing or listening, if they want to take away some information from that and incorporate it into their ministries or their counseling careers, whatever, I'd rather do it in full.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That makes sense, Dr. Coyle. Thank you.
Okay. Let me say another thing about men, what we've observed that I think is very destructive, not just for them, but for our society. And that's what an elective abortion can do to their masculinity. Very threatening, very damaging. And of course, for a man, that is a core piece of his identity, just as the feminine piece is a core part of a female's.
Mhm.
Men can be harmed this way, I think, because they perceive themselves as having failed to meet the role expectations. And again, my demographic may have some very different ones, but some I think always remain the same. I think they're so ingrained in us, probably at a biochemical level, um, that the feeling of failing to protect his partner or his child, and the heartbreak of having to make a choice between which one of those he's going to protect, is very damaging to masculinity. So again, that's another piece why we really need to look at reproductive history with all clients to find out if that is possibly an issue.
Dr. Coyle, this could real
yeah.
quickly, that can go alongside a sense of relief, would you say? I mean, that's something I see sometimes. It's very confusing because on one hand, they're like, oh, phew, this crisis is resolved, which feels like a manly thing to do. I've resolved this
Yeah.
crisis. But
Yeah.
there's also other part of them is experiencing exactly what you're talking about, which is it damages their manhood on a kind of a primal level. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. I think you've made a really good point. And where does that go then? If they're feeling relief, then relief becomes a cover, a little safety blanket for now to bury those other things. But sooner or later, it's going to have to be dealt with. We know this. We can't get away from it. We know that relationships are affected. We don't know though really how many relationships fail. Again, because there isn't enough research, but looking at what's out there, it's anywhere from 25 to about 70% of relationships fail. And something that was stunning to me, absolutely stunning. And God knows I'm not immune to repression myself, but the number of people who simply never talk about this to their partner after it's over. And maybe that also goes back to your thoughts about the relief that, okay, time to move on. But to never talk about something like that again.
It shouts out something really powerful that you would never want to go back there, which is so unusual for a couple because they talk about all kinds of stuff when they're intimate, when they have any kind of, even a relatively new relationship. If you begin to bond with the person, you're talking about stuff. If to never go back there again, it says something very powerful about the wound, doesn't it?
Very powerful. And it also is even more glaring when you think about the fact that pick up any book about how to have a good relationship, a good marriage, a good parent-child relationship. What's way up there? Number one, communication. There's got to be open communication about unpleasant issues of all sorts. So why would we not expect there to be relationship fallout? And of course, then it's always complicated by a man and a woman who manage to stay together. They're in somewhat different places as they're moving through this post-abortion journey.
Absolutely.
And well, again, it goes back to, will therapists then recognize that and consider the importance? And I guess we do what we can to try to convince them. But I want to say a little bit more about counseling because I think we're getting near.
We have a few minutes. So please.
Okay. Well, you and I have talked now about, first of all, the need has to be recognized and how we might make that happen. And one of the ways being routinely exploring men's and women's reproduction histories. I am a big believer in giving people the opportunity to tell their story. Let them take as long as they want with some gentle guiding questions coming from the therapist or the clergy, whoever it is, the good friend who's listening. Just let them tell their story. And I want to read a quote about storytelling to you from, I think it's a female author, McCrate, that storytelling or narration, which is, the term used in psychology, may be a powerful tool for accessing hidden grief, as the telling offers men a way to discuss their experience in a way which does not compromise their male roles. So it gives them the power to choose what they're going to disclose, how they're going to disclose it. And then it's on it's the responsibility of the counselor then to come back with occasional gentle leading questions. Another really important thing about just the relief of disclosure, there's the affirmation as they are listened to without judgment. But we also have some evidence, and this has nothing to do with my research, this is just research on narration, that being able to form a coherent story of one's experience is associated with improvements in both psychological and physical health. So storytelling is powerful. And I think that's another thing we can encourage therapists to explore with their clients.
That's an excellent point, Dr. Coyle. In my own experience with folks, I see that there's a fragmentation that happens on a lot of different levels after the abortion. And it's hard to put the pieces together, what happened. And as you begin to tell as you just mentioned, being able to tell your story, develop a cohesive narrative, connect with, after that, hopefully you can maybe connect with healing resources. That helps people begin to understand at a level and understand their experience that is really, truly healing, and opens the door for healing in other parts of their lives. So thanks so much for bringing that point up. And I want to assure our viewers that we're going to have Dr. Coyle on again, I hope soon, and she can continue to share her insights, and we'll talk about forgiveness therapy and whatever else she feels is important that we cover. Dr. Coyle, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us today. I'm so grateful. I found it so interesting and helpful, and I hope our viewers did as well. And I'll tell folks when we finish as well, please share. There's going to be a link available on this program. Share this with those professionals, clergy persons, lay people, family members that would benefit from what Dr. Coyle was sharing today. Thanks so much, Dr. Coyle.
Thank you, Kevin. It's great to see you again. It's been a long time.
Yes, indeed. Friends, I hope that you'll, as I just mentioned, don't let this information just bless you. You want to extend that blessing to others and that awareness to others. Remember, if you or someone you love has an abortion in their history, they can go to abortionforgiveness.com. We mentioned the Men in Abortion Network today, meninabortion.net. And you'll see on the screen as well, Dr. Coyle's organization, the Alliance for Post-Abortion Research and Training, with her colleague, Dr. Vincent Rue. God bless you, friends.